Welcome back to the channel. Recently I had a fair bit of success with capturing some swallow action shots, including images of them taking bugs out of the air. So I thought I'd put together another video to show some of this action and to provide a few tips for those wishing to capture similar images. I used the Sony Alpha 1 and the 200 to 600G lens, and for some of the images and video I also used the 1.4 teleconverter. Initially I'd set out to test the 200 to 600G and the 1.4 TC for swallows because I hadn't really done that previously when I was mainly using the 100 to 400 GM. Things got a bit hijacked when I found the swallows feeding in a frenzy, so I took the opportunity to see if I could get some good bug shots. These images aren't as good as the images I captured previously with the 100 to 400 GM lens. However, the conditions were different and I couldn't get as close to the birds this time. There was also a lot less wind blowing, so the birds were moving quite a bit faster and it was far more difficult to keep them in the frame. Just to put things in perspective, here is a short clip showing the normal speed action. And as you know, with swallows it's pretty hectic. As you can see, it's quite a challenge to get the bird in the frame and keep them there for long enough to acquire focus and to capture a few frames of the action. Most of the capture sequences of the birds taking bugs out of the air are less than 2 seconds from the time acquisition starts to the last image with the bird in the frame. Bear in mind that you're aiming to capture the action when the birds are close to you in order to fill the frame and get the best image quality. So far I've found that it's extremely difficult to do this with a focal length of more than 500 millimeters. One would think that 600 millimeter at a greater distance would be similar to 400 millimeter close by, but for some reason it becomes a real challenge to keep them in the frame at 600 millimeters. I never really got to try the 100 to 400 out this time because the feeding frenzies are quite brief, so I tend to stick with the gear that I've set up. As it turned out, a hobby or falcon came past in the morning and chased the swallows away after a few minutes. Fortunately, I managed to find them later that afternoon at another location, feeding on the hatching nymphs. It can take a bit of work to find swallows that are feeding, so I'm always on the lookout for groups of swallows. It is best to find a location where they are present and then watch them over a period of time to see what their feeding patterns are. A location where there are a lot of insect hatches is a good place to start, but it can still take a year or more to learn the cycles. The location you can see in this video clip is a lane between two rows of bushes, and the bugs congregate in this lane out of the breeze. As you can see, the swallows mostly fly up and down the lane, so you've got an excellent chance of keeping them in the frame as they fly towards you. To take photographs, I would usually position myself lower than shown here. Sitting on that ground is perfect for this situation, and a beach chair with a backrest is ideal. These are some images captured on the first day of this recent outing, when the wind was in the wrong direction, so the birds were backlit and I'd used very high ISO and slow shutter speeds. Still, downsampled to 2048 pixels wide, the images are usable, but not great when viewed on a 5K display. These images are taken in good light, with the sun and what little wind there was coming from behind me. As you can see, the image quality is dramatically improved, even with the heavy cropping that is still required. This is some slow motion footage taken while the birds are feeding on emerging nymphs. I was using the 200 to 600 with the 1.4 teleconverter at 840 millimeters. At normal speed the footage is terribly shaky, but at 8 times slow motion it turns out great, I think. Bear in mind that a 1 second real world capture is 10 seconds of video, so many of these clips are not much more than 3 seconds in the real world. I noticed that the swallows periodically make a dash for the sky, and I assumed this is as a result of some scare, as they will usually fly very high if a falcon is in the vicinity. If you watch carefully in the following clip, you'll notice that the birds are flying their usual lazy feeding patterns when they all of a sudden speed up and make a dash for the sky. I found it interesting how they all respond instantly to some signal I couldn't detect. Even birds a long way off seem to detect the same signal and respond. Let's take a look at a few capture sequences to show the focus acquisition and tracking until a bird is big enough in the frame for a reasonable image. Notice how on this first one I failed to acquire focus initially when the bird was very low and near the ground. Eventually, after about 1 second, I did manage to acquire focus and pressed the shutter button just 4 frames from before the action takes place. But notice how well the A1 tracks the bird's eyes all the way until I lose it. So there are some nice in-flight images from the sequence as well. Bear in mind this entire sequence takes less than 2 seconds from the start of acquisition until the last frame, so a fast responsive camera is critical. There appears to be nothing wrong with the 200 to 600 focus speed either, so nothing to worry about in that department. It has no trouble keeping up. This next sequence shows the background separation you can achieve by keeping low to the ground. This helps avoid losing the subject in the busy background. This entire sequence is less than 1/3 of a second long. Finally, a sequence that demonstrates how well the Alpha 1 tracks small, fast-moving subjects. Bear in mind that I'm positioned low down to create a large separation between the subject and the background, which helps prevent loss of focus because of this distracting background. And of course, not everyone is in focus. From these images, you can see the typical amount of cropping that is required, which is more than I would usually like, but the images taken in good light still look great on my 5K display. Some of the images you'll notice are slightly out of focus or blurred because of motion blur. I'm not entirely sure which, but I'm just showing them anyway. It's pretty much what you can expect when you're capturing these kinds of images. Some of them will be slightly off. The last 3 images in the sequence suffer from a little motion blur, but I have applied additional sharpening to them, and you can see the slight improvement in the result. I've also downsampled one of the images, as that helps minimize any out of focus or motion blur and is suitable for social media. Another sequence where you'll notice in the first image it's slightly out of focus, but how quick the camera is to recover and lock on focus. Here are some images shot with the 200 to 600 and the 1.4 teleconverter. These birds are feeding over the water. And to finish off, one final sequence of captured images showing how I acquire focus when the bird is somewhere off and then follow it as it comes towards me. After having observed the usual flight patterns, I can be reasonably sure of the bird's flight path.